I will recall a joke from my childhood years when Neil Armstrong flies to the moon. They see that there is smoke on the moon. They approach and see that people are cooking barbecue there. And when they ask, "What are you doing here?" people say, "No, we are cooking and eating barbecue here." And where are you from? We're from Atlanta and Nakan. We're coming here every weekend. And why aren't you telling other people that you do that? Because if we tell that, you would probably accuse us of being those boasty Leninakansis. Yes, this is well known that we have big mouth. We're big-mouthed, and this is very painful for girls to be a big-mouthed Leninakansi. There were some jokes, and this is what Yerevansis were telling about us Gyumritsis. But you won't get this. If you go to a dentist will put the chair into your mouth and will easily work on your teeth if you are from Gyumri. Because you are big-mouthed. Sometimes we are described as very humorous. Sometimes we're described as fools. Sometimes we're described as, or some people are described in Armenia as humorous, others as very generous, others as very smart, still others as fool. Why? You probably can make some associations with different cities, and I was always offended by the fact that we are. And we hear jokes about people from Gabrovo in Bulgaria, about people from Aparan in Armenia. And if you look at the image of Gyumretsis, we are probably the closest to people from Odessa in terms of our humor and the way we live. In order to understand whether this happened by accident or it happened by a chance or frivolously, or there is some reality behind that, I would like to suggest an option or hypothesis. This is something that I came with when I was looking at Gyumri's 19th century documents. We deal with a city that, as Karin presented in detail, and I'm very grateful to her for presenting the history of the city, so I don't need to repeat it, because without that it is impossible to understand the social story and social narrative of the city. I would skip that part, but I would say that Gyumri of the 19th century is a city that is developing in the modern times, because there is classical approach, and if we accept the definition of Adam Street of the modern city as industrial city, Max Weber says that it's a place where political processes unfold, and we have Fernand Braudel's important contribution that it should be a marketplace, so market should function there. So the combination of all three creates a modern city that is different, more or less, from medieval cities or other cities. This is a modern city. However, recently there is another feature of the modern city added up to it. Strangely enough, it is linked or connected to humor. Hakarainen looks at the 19th century media or printed media and talks about so-called comical modernity. This is about 19th century, comical modernity in 19th century, where pressure with tensions or relations that could be created between rapidly urbanizing or within the rapidly urbanizing areas is very important. And to actually create those links, we use humor Humor could be used in writing, but most often it is used orally, as oral narrative. We know Carnival Love of Mikhail Bakhtin, fundamental work, and we all have some kind of such carnival love, but whatever is seen by or in conjunction with the 19th century carnival love is rather a factor that shows how in the city area a new identity is being formed, which is very close to the national identity. If I make a reference to Benedict Anderson's imaginative nationality or nationalities, I would say that there is imaginative city identities. There are some places where people start feeling themselves as part of that district or of that identity. If we go back to the lecture by Professor Humphrey, I would probably say that you decide how to own or divide and how to fill your own space, and your feelings may not be the same as the feelings of the others, and sometimes it leads to so-called ghettoism. You sometimes have religious ghettos, you have national ghettos where you have people of the same national, religious, or other identity located, and they isolate themselves and they build fences and borders. And how you can overcome those? I would say probably most of the solutions are linked to humor, and Odessa, Gabrovo, or other hubs of humor, or the capitals of humor, for us the same as Gyumri, because Gyumri is considered to be the capital of humor among the Armenian cities. These cities have some similar features and of course some differences as well. Unfortunately, I cannot go into the depth of this discussion and discuss many details, but there are some visible similarities. With Odessa, we were in the same empire. We had the same development time, rapid development time during the same period. We have received many newcomers in large numbers, and we have to accommodate them, and we have to create new links and actually synthesize people who are living in the city for a long time with those who are newcomers, create a humorous approach. And we have specific humor in multi-layer and multi-segment humor in Gyumri as well as in Odessa. So in Odessa, they speak on behalf of the Jewish community. They are trying to imitate, I would say, Jewish accents in Russian language, and it creates some exotic notion, but it is not actually suggested by the people who are the main objects or subjects of those jokes, because usually those are grotesque figures, sometimes presented under a very negative light. In Gyumri, you have quite different picture. You have both positive and negative notion in the same joke, and this surprises me, because if you create, let's say, a hero of a joke, it is very difficult to explain this dichotomy. So whose narrative is being presented in that case, of the positive or negative hero? In order to understand this, I tried to look at the interpretations, approaches, comments that we have in the study of Gyumri humor done by anthropologists. And I have found three main directions. One of those directions, or three functions actually, that humor does. It's kind of cohesion, solidarity, harmony. That's what is the ability of the humor. And if you look at humor, you see that one of them is public sanction when you try to impose something on someone, so you mock that person to the end that that person accepts that. In Gyumri vocabulary, it is called doshkel, which means targeting. You choose one person, you try to focus on that person all the impressions, or I would say perceptions, that you have. The second one is tension relief. You are in a tense situation, you have to get actually rid of it. Very often we see that there is aggressive behavior and aggression, and there is laughter, and often these are the two sides of the same coin. Wherever we have laughter, you have to look for hidden aggression or tension. You are not showing that, or unable to show that, you want to avoid, detour that, but it turns into laughter and to hide it. And the third one is actually what I have started my story, my narrative with. When you try to show your dominance over another person, and it becomes in itself quite a humorous situation, because when you try to boast, you try to position yourself above the others, and you try to consider yourself to be better than others, you sometimes run into very funny situations. You make actually fun of yourself. So and instead of killing each other, people were opting for laughter. If we follow the trend, we will see that, as Professor Humphrey was presenting in her work on pogroms in Odessa, speaking about multiculturalism, she shows how this two could be actually reconciled in one community, live peaceful together in one community. In my case, this is not an exception, but rather it is the rule, because if you look at the social history of Gyumri, as presented by Karina, it helps you to see how these boundaries sometimes are created, and where do you see those spaces for laughter. Those are created exactly in those places where there are boundaries. So if I look at the Frederick Barth's theory, what becomes the marker or boundary between the cultures, what qualities and features actually make you divide yourself from others, and makes you draw boundaries. So wherever you create those boundaries, you also create group identity.
Creating a space which allows humor to come about, to emerge. In the case of Gyumri, here's what I understood. This diverse type of humor has several layers. The first layer I uncovered is the tension, social tension of local rural dwellers. It initially used to be a village, like Arne told you. There were several houses of Persians and Armenians that were augmented with the urban population. In the course of Russo-Turkish War, great masses from Turkish Armenia have moved and settled exactly there. Those who moved were also urban dwellers. There was a special resettlement committee that brought former urban dwellers and resettled them in urban areas, and did the same with the rural population. So this tension between the urban and rural people, which exists everywhere in Gyumri, reached vulgar dimensions. They were persecuting villagers and mocking them to the extent that all of this material from the 19th century all the way through the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. They said if a villager comes and holds the handle of your gate, just discard the whole gate. together with the handle, it's almost like desecrated. The fact that even the old churches in the city were built amongst this juxtaposition, counterpoint between the villagers and the urban settlers. The district where the villagers lived had a church called Rural Villagers' Church, Rustic Church. The rational explanation would be that it was in the district populated by villagers, but this is exacerbated by yet another layer of a story, that the rural settlers went to the major church or cathedral. They were not let in. They took offense that they had to be kicked back into the churches in the outskirts. So the priest came out, leaving the mass halfway through, which is unheard of, and brings these people back. So this is how this church became, so to say, the church of the villagers. It's clear that stories like this, narratives like this, just highlight the lines drawn and the tensions that have arisen. Why it was so more pronounced in this city than elsewhere? I assume that this could be ascribed to the fact that customarily the newcomers are villagers and the locals are urban settlers. During the formation of Gyumri in the 17th century, it was just the opposite. The locals were the villagers, and there were urban settlers who came in, who had less eligibility, even in Lefebvre's context, towards the space, which is why they could not use their muscle. They had to find something to replace this power, and that was humor, mockery, which was less of an aggressive expression than brute force. I will skip some parts of this presentation to fit within the time. Another important circumstance that makes Gyumri stand out in the diversity of its humor is the fact that the newcomers settled predominantly in a ghettoized settlements. The urban settlers from the same district settled in one district in a compact way. So these borders, if in the case of Odessa, if we use Newtat's characteristic, if there is the mob and the polity, they either unite, or there's some, like Professor Humphrey described. In this case was more essentialistic, because you have those real life boundaries drawn, and there are the centers of each such perimeter with the church in the middle. Even coming from various communities, being Armenian, nonetheless they belong to various denominations: Catholics, Protestants, Evangelists, Armenian Apostolic Church followers. Each had their own church. And if you look at how they celebrated the anniversary of the invention of Armenian script, it is quite characteristic as how early 20th century there was this whole march from one district to the other, a procession joining these churches together because each had its own seminary or school. The church became the origin of a community, and it's customary. In the 19th century, people usually lived in communal settings within empires. So when they resettled, they recreated those same communal feelings. They called each other names collectively. These are the stingy ones. Those from Kars, those from Erzurum have good work ethics. Those from Bayazet perhaps are big mouths. So by calling each other names, there came a time when this was targeting a particular group, because those were the labels that were fluid. They changed over time. When it came to a period when, in particular in the wake of the genocide, when orphans flood the city, when during the Soviet times lot of people resettle from the villages. This integration, as opposed to same Odessa, the reason may be that although there were local differences in culture, ethnically this was essentially the only Armenian city in the 19th century where we had absolutely Armenian majority in the population, 95% that is. So this possibility of mixing, mingling, and replacing aggression with a joke becomes the urban habitus, way of communication. Another important thing here is that I have to skip several slides as well here. One important thing is that the social stratification is not so pronounced. This is mostly a city of artisans and traders. If you look at these numbers, you'll see that the absolute majority, 20,240 as of the census in 1897, were the craftsmen and traders. So this stratum practiced customarily this common urban habit of mockery. So the joke that I started my story with about the braggart Gyumri, this is the habit of traders and artisans that advertise their wares, and this type of advertising erases the line between the person and the goods and the wares. So this bragging becomes the customary thing. Another important thing is associated with the language. The advertising language in a city with so many traders and merchants becomes the koine, it becomes the language of the public space. This language also is very artsy, it's very sticky and rich in imagery. It's hard to retell Gyumri jokes because it's replete with the imagery of the language. They do not joke, they just speak like that. They speak like that even in the most horrendous of situations. During the earthquake, a woman half dead, suspended, and this is witness testimony, suspended from the wall. Someone asks from the down there, "Is your neighbor there?" She says, "In our carriage, no one like that." Even in those conditions, in that situation, it's irrelevant. It's their just way of being, modus vivendi. The most jokes I encountered were exactly in the wake of the earthquake. The reason I'm saying this language is also augmented by the dialect being quite distinctly different from other Armenian dialects. If a Gyumri guy speaks two words in Armenian, you already pinpoint. You already start laughing because this type of an alien dialect for the listener already is laughing stock. It's quite similar to the Russian Jewish mode of speaking in Odessa, which in and of itself is already funny. It makes you believe that you're encountering some exotic character. This is, of course, epitomizing a serious imperialist attitude. You ascribe a person to a character and you see this character regardless of who's standing before you. One of my friends told me when I come to Yerevan, I have not yet opened my mouth, they already asked me for a joke. Looks like I'm a joke dispenser. You drop a coin, I tell a joke. Even this is an explanation that is metaphorical. about the Soviet period. There comes another stratum, a layer, when Gyumri starts to compete with Yerevan, because the Soviet cities were built in a hierarchic structure. This is, if you remember, to demonstrate the superiority in this contest. There's a big series emerging on how Yerevan dwellers come and attempt to pull practical jokes over Gyumri dwellers. They miserably fail and get back in dismay because those guys are more witty. This is not so characteristic for the Soviet period as the Vartanik, Margot, and Klorikian narratives. These jokes that sometimes are similar to some extent to the Russian jokes about Vovochka. What's remarkable is that Vartanik here has certain things resonating with Vovochka, but the characters are similar. An F student, a very strict, not always adequate headmistress, a intoxicated father figure. These are the characters that fall outside of the Soviet ossified ideological language and acceptable characters. This is beyond that. This is a type of... There is Radio Yerevan joke series that I do not believe have originated in Armenia. This is more local. This is more of an introspective joke where people are in the non-Soviet space, what Yurchak calls outside-edness. You can reduce everything to a joke and play around with it. And last but not least, two more layers. I know my time is expiring. I'll merge these two together. One is about humor in the Soviet period becoming institutionalized. The character is borrowed by the state, by the TV. The Gyumri already is cognizant of himself or herself as such and starts to replicate the character, rolling it out. As a result, we end up with even actors who are identified with the Gyumri character. Even today, Evangelion fell into the same trap. Well, it's not a trap. You just can't ignore this material. It becomes an urban character in the movies, in cinematography, and moreover, the last layer and stratum is that this character gets commercialized, sold to tourists as a local exotic feature. Humor which was emerging in the past to circumnavigate the cute corners and tensions between various social groups. In this particular circumstance, it transforms into a pleasing smile that is just called upon to bring in additional cash. In this sense, this is becoming an object of trade rather than a creative outburst. The best example is that before the tourist boom of 2017, 2016, prior to that, the youth in the city attached funny plaques at various locations. Gyumri is the center of the world, but the other states ignore it. Similar statements, phrases, people, I talked to those who posted this. Sad and weary person walks by it and just gets a smile. This was a feature addressed to the city dwellers that they claimed they would save the city with humor. But the same young people, several years down the road during this tourist boom, were already creating a wall of jokes, trilingual, for external consumption. These jokes were already meant for external consumption. and had to be perused. This was in a nutshell what I had to say. By way of conclusion, let me tell you that it seems to me the case of Gyumri reminds me of caricature in fine arts. When you want to present something, you exaggerate certain features, make them more pronounced than they are in real life, making it better recognizable and at the same time funny. Gyumri, in this sense, becomes a caricature of a city. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Gayane.